Section 17 of After Dark. This is LibriVox Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Oliver Walton. After Dark by Wilkie Collins. The French Governess's Story of Sister Rose. Part 2nd, Chapter 3, Part 2. "My lord the President," began the poor girl firmly. Her next words were drowned in a volley of hisses from the women. "Ah, aristocrat, aristocrat, none of your accursed titles here," was their shrill cry at her. She fronted that cry. She fronted the fierce gestures which accompanied it. With the steady light still in her eyes, with the strange rigidity still fastened on her face, she would have spoken again through the uproar and execration, but her brother's voice overpowered her. "Citizen President," she cried, "I have not concluded. I demand leave to complete my confession. I implore the tribunal to attach no importance to what my sister says. The trouble and terror of this day have shaken her intellects. She is not responsible for her words. I assert it solemnly, in the face of the whole court." The blood flew up into his white face as he made the asseveration. Even at that supreme moment, the great heart of the man reproached him for yielding himself to a deception, though the motive of it was to save his sister's life. "Let her speak! Let her speak!" exclaimed the woman, as Rose, without moving, without looking at her brother, without seeming even to have heard what he said, made a second attempt to address the judges, in spite of Trudaine's interposition. "Silence!" shouted the man with the bludgeon. "Silence, you woman! The citizen president is going to speak." "Prisoner Trudaine has the ear of the court," said the president, "and may continue his confession. If the female prisoner wishes to speak, she may be heard afterward. I enjoin both the accused persons to make short work of it with their addresses to me, or they will make their case worse instead of better. I command silence among the audience, and if I am not obeyed, I will clear the hall. Now, prisoner Trudaine, I invite you to proceed. No more about your sister. Let her speak for herself. Your business and ours is with the man and woman Dubois. Are you, or are you not, ready to tell the court who they are?" "I repeat that I am ready," answered Trudaine. "The citizen Dubois is a servant. The woman Dubois is a mother of the man who denounces me, Superintendent Danville." A low, murmuring, rushing sound of hundreds of exclaiming voices, all speaking half suppressedly at the same moment, followed the delivery of the answer. No officer of the court attempted to control the outburst of astonishment. The infection of it spread to the persons on the platform, to the crier himself, to the judges of the tribunal, lounging, but the moment before, so carelessly silent in their chairs. When the noise was at length quelled, it was subdued in the most instantaneous manner by one man who shouted from the throng behind the president's chair, "Clear the way there! Superintendent Danville is taken ill." Vehement whispering and contending of many voices interrupting each other followed, and then a swaying among the assembly of official people, and then a great stillness. Then the sudden appearance of Danville, alone, at the table. The look of him as he turned his ghastly face towards the audience, silenced and steadied them in an instant, just as they were on the point of falling into fresh confusion. Every one stretched forward eagerly to hear what he would say. His lips moved, but the few words that fell from them were inaudible, except to the persons who happened to be close to him. Having spoken, he left the table supported by a police agency, who was seen to lead him towards the private door of the court, and consequently also towards the prisoner's platform. He stopped, however, halfway, quickly turned his face from the prisoners, and pointing towards the public door at the opposite side of the hall, caused himself to be led out into the air by that direction. When he had gone, the president, addressing himself partly to Trudaine and partly to the audience, said, "The citizen Superintendent Danville has been overcome by the heat in the court. He has retired, by my desire, under the care of a police agent, to recover in the open air, pledging himself to me to come back and throw a new light on the extraordinary and suspicious statement which the prisoner has just made. Until the return of citizen Danville, I order the accused, Trudaine, to suspend any further acknowledgment of complicity which he may have to address me. This matter may be cleared up before other matters are entered on. Meanwhile, in order that the time of the tribunal may not be wasted, I authorize the female prisoner to take this opportunity of making any statement concerning herself which she may wish to address to the judges." "Silence him! Remove him out of the court! Gag him! Guillotine him!" These cries rose from the audience the moment the president had done speaking. They were all directed at Trudaine, who had made a last desperate effort to persuade his sister to keep silent, and had been detected in the attempt by the spectators. "If the prisoner speaks another word to his sister, remove him," said the president, addressing the guard around the platform. "Good. We shall hear her at last." "Silence! Silence!" exclaimed the women, settling themselves comfortably on their benches and preparing to resume their work. "Rose Danville, the court is waiting to hear you," said the president, crossing his legs and leaning back luxuriously in his large armchair. Amid all the noise and confusion of the last few minutes, Rose had stood ever in the same attitude, with that strangely fixed expression never altering on her face, but once. When her husband had made his way to the side of the table and stood there prominently alone, her lips trembled a little, and a faint shade of colour passed swiftly over her cheeks. Even that slight change had vanished now. She was paler, stiller, more widely altered from her former self than ever as she faced the president and said these words: "I wish to follow my brother's example and make my confession, as he has made his. I would rather he had not spoken for me, but he is too generous to say any words except such as he thinks may save me from sharing his punishment. I refuse to be saved unless he is saved with me. Where he goes when he leaves this place, I will go. What he suffers, I will suffer. If he is to die, I believe God will grant me the strength to die resignedly with him." She paused for a moment and half turned towards Trudaine, then checked herself instantly and went on. "This is what I now wish to say, as to my share in the offence charged against my brother. Some time ago, he told me one day that he had seen my husband's mother in Paris, disguised as a poor woman, that he had spoken to her and forced her to acknowledge herself. Up to this time, we had all felt certain that she had left France, because she held old-fashioned opinions, which it is dangerous for people to hold now, had left France before we came to Paris. She told my brother that she had indeed gone, with an old, tried servant of the family to help and protect her, as far as Marseille, and that, finding unforeseen difficulty there in getting further, she had taken it as a warning from Providence not to desert her son, of whom she was very passionately fond, and from whom she had been most unwilling to depart. Instead of waiting in exile for quieter times, she determined to go and hide herself in Paris, knowing her son was going there too. She assumed the name of her old and faithful servant, who declined to the last to leave her unprotected, and she proposed to live in the strictest secrecy and retirement, watching, unknown, the career of her son, and ready at a moment's notice to disclose herself to him, when the settlement of public affairs might reunite her safety to her beloved child. My brother thought this plan full of danger, both for herself and for her son, and for the honest old man who was risking his head for his mistress' sake. I thought so too, and in an evil hour I said to Louis, 'Will you try in secret to get my husband's mother away, and see that her faithful servant makes her really leave France this time?' I wrongfully asked my brother to do this for a selfish reason of my own, a reason connected with my married life, which had not been a happy one. I had not succeeded in gaining my husband's affection, and was not treated kindly by him. My brother, who had always loved me far more dearly, I'm afraid, than I've ever deserved, my brother increased his kindness to me, seeing me treated unkindly by my husband. This made ill blood between them. My thought when I asked my brother to do for me what I have said was that if we two in secret saved my husband's mother, without danger to him, from imperiling herself and her son, we should, when the time came for speaking of what we had done, appear to my husband in a new and better light. I should have shown how well I deserved his love, and Louis would have shown how well he deserved his brother-in-law's gratitude, and so we should have made home happy at last, and all three have lived together affectionately. This was my thought, and when I told it to my brother and asked him if there would be much risk, out of his kindness and indulgence towards me, he said no. He had so used me to accept sacrifices for my happiness that I let him endanger himself to help me in my little household plan. I repent this bitterly now. I ask his pardon with my whole heart. If he is acquitted, I shall try to show myself worthier of his love. If he is found guilty, I too will go to the scaffold and die with my brother, who risked his life for my sake." She ceased as quietly as she began, and turned once more to her brother. As she looked away from the court and looked at him, a few tears came into her eyes, and something of the old softness of form and gentleness of expression seemed to return to her face. He let her take his hand, but he seemed purposely to avoid meeting the anxious gaze she fixed on him. His head sunk on her breast. He drew his breath heavily. His countenance darkened and grew distorted, as if he was suffering some sharp pang of physical pain. He bent down a little, and, leaning his elbow on the rail before him, covered his face with his hand, and so quelled the rising agony, so forced back the scalding tears to his heart. The audience had heard Rose in silence, and they preserved the same tranquillity when she had done. This was a rare tribute to a prisoner from the people of the Reign of Terror. The President looked round to his colleagues and shook his head suspiciously. "This statement of the female prisoners complicates the matter very seriously," he said. "Is there anybody in court," he added, looking at the persons behind his chair, "who knows where the mother of Superintendent Danville and the servant are now?" Lomaque came forward to the appeal and placed himself by the table. "Why, citizen agent," continued the President, looking hard at him, "are you overcome by the heat too?" "The fit seemed to take him, citizen President, when the female prisoner had made an end of her statement," exclaimed Magloire, pressing forward officiously. Lomaque gave his subordinate a look which sent the man back directly to the shelter of the official group, and then said in lower tones that were customary to him, "I have received information relative to the mother of Superintendent Danville and the servant, and am now ready to answer any questions that may be put to me." "Where are they now?" asked the President. "She and the servant are known to have crossed the frontier, and are supposed to be on their way to Cologne, but since they entered Germany, their whereabouts is necessarily a matter of uncertainty to the Republican authorities." "Have you any information relevant to the conduct of the old servant while he was in Paris?" "I have information enough to prove that he was not an object for political suspicion. He seems to have simply animated by servile zeal for the woman's interests, to have performed for her all the menial offices of a servant in private, and to have misled the neighbours by affected equality with her in public." "Have you any reason to believe that Superintendent Danville was privy to his mother's first attempt at escaping from France?" "I infer it what the female prisoner has said, and that for other reasons, which it would be irregular to detain before the tribunal. The proofs can no doubt be obtained if I am to allow time to communicate with the authorities at Lyons and Marseille." At this moment Danville re-entered the court, and advancing to the table, placed himself close to the chief agent's side. They looked each other steadily in the face for an instant. "He has recovered from the shock of Trudaine's answer," thought Lomaque, retiring. "His hand trembles, his face is pale, and I can see regained self-possession in his eyes, and I dread the consequences already." "Citizen President," began Danville, "I demand to know if anything has transpired affecting my honour and patriotism in my absence." He spoke apparently with the most perfect calmness, but he looked nobody in the face. His eyes were fixed steadily on the green baize of the chair beneath him. "The female prisoner has made a statement referring principally to herself and her brother," answered the President, "but incidentally mentioning a previous attempt on your mother's part to break existing laws by emigrating from France. This portion of the confession contains in it some element of suspicion which seriously affect you. They shall be suspicious no longer. At my own peril I will change them to certainties," exclaimed Danville, extending his arm theatrically, and looking up for the first time. "Citizen President, I avow it with the fearless frankness of a good patriot. I was privy to my mother's first attempt at escaping from France." Hisses and cries of execration followed this confession. He winced under them at first, but recovering his self-possession before silence was restored. "Citizens, you have heard the confession of my fault," he resumed, turning with desperate assurance towards the audience. "Now hear the atonement I have made for it at the altar of my country." He waited at the end of that sentence until the secretary to the tribunal had done writing it down in the report book of the court. "Transcribe faithfully to the letter," cried Danville, pointing solemnly to the open page of the volume. "Life and death hang on to my word." The secretary took a fresh dip of ink, and nodded to show that he was ready. Danville went on. "In these words of glory and trial for France," he proceeded, pitching his voice to a tone of deep emotion, "where are all good citizens most sacredly bound to? To immolate their dearest private affections and interests before their public duties. On the first attempt of my mother to violate the laws against emigration, by escaping from France, I failed in making the heroic sacrifices which inexorable patriotism demanded from me. My situation was more terrible than the situation of Brutus, sitting in judgment of his own sons. I had not the Roman fortitude to rise equal to it. I erred, citizens, I erred as Coriolanus did, when his august mother pleaded with him for the safety of Rome. For that error I deserved to be purged out of the Republican community, but I escaped my merited punishment. Nay, I even rose to the honour of holding an office under the government. Time passed, and again my mother attempted an escape from France. Again inevitable fate brought my civic virtue to the test. How did I meet this second supremest trial? By an atonement for past weakness, terrible as the trial itself. Citizens, you will shudder, but you will applaud whilst you tremble. Citizens, look, and whilst you look, remember well the evidence given at the opening of this case. Yonder stands the enemy of his country, who intrigued to help my mother to escape. Here stands the patriot son, whose voice was the first, the only voice to denounce himself for the crime. As he spoke, he pointed to Trudaine, then struck himself on the breast and folded his arms, and looked sternly at the benches occupied by the spectators. "Do you assert," exclaimed the President, "that at the time when you denounced Trudaine, you knew him to be intriguing to aid your mother's escape?" "I assert it," answered Danville. The pen which the President held dropped from his hand at that reply. His colleagues started and looked at each other in blank silence. A murmur of "Monster! Monster!" began from the prisoner on the platform, and spread instantly to the audience, who echoed and echoed it again. The fiercest woman Republican on the benches joined cause at last with the haughtiest women aristocrats on the platform. Even in that sphere of direct discords, in that age of sharpest enemies, the one touch of nature preserved its old eternal virtue, and roused the mother instinct which makes the whole world kin. Of the few persons in the court who at once foresaw the effect of Danville's answer on the proceedings of the tribunal, Lomaque was one. His sallow face whitened as he looked towards the prisoner's platform. "They are lost," he murmured to himself, moving out of the group in which he had hitherto stood. "Lost! The lie which had saved that villain's head leaves them without the shadow of a hope. No need to stop for the sentence. Danville's infamous presence of mind had given them up to the guillotine." Pronouncing these words, he went out hurriedly to a door near the platform, which led to the prisoner's waiting room. Rose's head sank against her brother's shoulder. She shuddered, and leaned back faintly on the arm which extended to support her. One of the female prisoners tried to help Trudaine in speaking consolingly to her, but the consummation of her husband's perfidy seemed to have paralysed her at heart. She murmured once in her brother's ear, "Louis, I am resigned to die. Nothing but death is left for me, after the degradation of having loved that man." She said those words and closed her eyes wearily, and spoke no more. "One other question, and you may retire," resumed the President, addressing Danville. "Were you cognizant to your wife's connections with her brother's conspiracy?" Danville reflected for a moment, remembered that there were witnesses in court who could speak to his language and behaviour on the evening of his wife's arrest, and resolved this time to tell the truth. "I was not aware of it," he answered. "Testimony in my favour can be called, which will prove that my wife's compliancy was discovered when I was absent from Paris." Heartlessly self-possessed as he was, the public reception of his last reply had shaken his nerve. He now spoke in low tones, turning his back on the spectators, and fixing his eyes again on the green baize of the table at which he stood. "Prisoners, have you any objection to make? Any evidence to call invalidating the statement by which Citizen Danville has cleared himself of suspicion?" inquired the President. "He has cleared himself by the most execrable of all falsehoods," answered Trudaine. "If his mother could be traced and brought here, her testimony would prove it." "Can you produce any other evidence in support of your allegation?" asked the President. "I cannot." "Citizen Superintendent Danville, you are at liberty to retire. Your statement will be laid down before the authority to whom you are officially responsible. Either you merit civic crown for more than Roman virtue, or, having got this far—" The President stopped abruptly, as if unwilling to commit himself too soon to an opinion, and merely repeated, "You may retire." Danville left the court immediately, going out again by the public door. He was followed by murmurs from the women's bench, which soon ceased, however, when the President was observed to close his notebook and turn round toward his colleagues. "The sentence!" was the general whisper now. "Hush, hush, the sentence!" After a consultation of a few minutes with the persons behind him, the President rose and spoke the momentous words. "Louis Trudaine and Rose Danville, the Revolutionary Tribunal, having heard the charge against you, and having weighed the value of what you have said in answer to it, decides that you are both guilty and condemns you to the penalty of death." Having delivered the sentence in those terms, he stood down again and placed a mark against the two first condemned names on the list of prisoners. Immediately afterward the next case was called upon, and the curiosity of the audience was stimulated by a new trial. End of section 17.